Bloomington has seen its share of amazing people over the years.
Hi, I'm Mark Cuban, and I'm about to give you some advice on how to...
I was the first woman to...
It's a story about a monkey.
If we could explain baseball to you.
I was born in a small town.
When I was writing this novel, and it's just beautiful, beautiful music.
I'd like to thank the Academy for naming me in this group.
Amazing people from Bloomington, Indiana. Bob Hammel is one of them.
Bob Hammel in Bloomington, a 50-year love affair, is made possible by Clendenning, Johnson & Boer, attorneys at law. Strength when you need it most. Indiana University Varsity Club, investing in the lives of student athletes. Smithville, the power behind life's moments. Weaver Popcorn, whether in the theater or at home, making popcorn part of memories. And by the WS Property Group, Eric Stolberg, Gentry Park, Bloomington. Old National Bank, Alejandra and Souheil Haddad, Curt Simic, Bill Walker. Additional support comes from Curiato Center, Heitink Veneers, IU Credit Union, McCrae and McCrae, Nick's Kitchen, the Trophy Center Plus, and by WTIU members. Thank you.
Amazing people from Bloomington, Indiana. Bob Hammel is one of them. The war's over. Life in small-town America was returning to normal, and a wide-eyed kid in Huntington, Indiana, got dosed with IU fever.
The very first game I listened to as an 8-year-old, IU won up at Michigan in 1945. IU winning at Michigan football. As an 8-year-old, I didn't understand how profound that was, but I got a sense of it, and so I locked onto this team. Those guys were my heroes. The YMCA, they'd show the game, that Saturday's game on like Tuesday night. I was there watching those games, and George Talafero, he tore a knee. And they told us that George was out for the year with a knee injury. I cried. I went home to my pillow and cried.
Huntington may indeed be a small Midwestern town, but small towns nurture large dreams. Here in Huntington, please think big.
Bloomington got its first taste of Bob Hammel in 1953. This 16-year-old from Huntington enrolled in the School of Journalism at IU.
I was 16 when I came to IU and to major in journalism. And at that point, they did not allow taking classes in your major. Everything was in what they called the junior division and liberal arts courses, but no journalism. and that's what I knew I wanted to do.
He lasted one school year before he headed back home to Huntington for an opportunity that would change his life.
In about April of that freshman year, the editor sent me a letter and said that their sports editor had left and wondered if I'd take the job during the summer while they looked for a replacement.
Herald Press was owned by the Quayle family. The sports editor would be covering essentially Huntington North high school sports and Huntington College sports.
The schools I was in never had a school paper, never had a journalism class. Never wrote for anybody except an in-class theme or something in the English comp. Yeah, would I take that job? Of course I would. It didn't occur to me that you're not in the least bit prepared for this. You haven't written anything yet for anybody. So I came strolling into that newspaper office on the morning of June 9th, 1954. Probably the greenest sports editor in the history of America. My very first column was on a local guy from Huntington County who was just getting started in television in New York. Chris Schenkel.
Let's join Chris Schenkel.
Well, Mr. President, Bud and I are so pleased that you came up into our office.
So I hitched onto a star right away. And Chris and I became really good friends over the years.
Bob was a natural. He flourished at his hometown paper and fully expected to spend his entire career there. That is, until he had an unsettling conversation with his boss, Jim Quayle.
Jim rode along with me in '63. I'm driving, and out of the blue, he says, tell me about your long-range plans. I'm probably going to be here for the rest of my life. I'm happy. I was enjoying what I was doing. He was very frank. He said, you know you're as high as you're ever going to get with us. If I were you, I would start looking around. Had that conversation not happened, I'm not sure that I ever would have.
So Bob took the advice to heart and began a journey that would bring him full circle back to Bloomington.
We had a lot of migration. My parents, when they were first married, my dad was working for the Huntington Herald Press in Huntington, and shortly after I was born, he decided to go over to Peru, to the newspaper there. And after 3 months of being over in Peru, ended up coming back to Huntington, and we were there until about 1963 or so. And then after that, Kokomo, and working in a startup, brand new newspaper. We were the trailing family, so we got there, and my dad had sized up that paper, even though it had started up, didn't look like it was going to be long-term successful. So he ended up starting to work for the Indianapolis News.
While Bob was finally finding some solid ground in Indianapolis, there were fateful events transpiring just 50 miles south along US 37.
We were in Western Maryland in Hagerstown for 2 years, where my dad was the managing editor. And then they bought the Bloomington and Bedford papers from Dagmar Riley. So when we moved here, this was a 6-day-a-week paper, Monday through Saturday. Dad, being the sports person that he was, thought, okay, so IU plays football on Saturday. The coverage locally was not in the paper until Monday. He decided that they would start a Sunday paper.
There was this newspaper battle going on. Another newspaper had started up in town, so to beat them on the sports coverage, be first, be the best, be accurate, that had to be the key vision. And so Bob Hammel was tapped to make that happen.
For all those years, the HT was the one newspaper in Bloomington. All of a sudden, in September of 1966, there's a second one called the Courier Tribune. I was at the Indianapolis News at the time. I liked the job. I was not unhappy at all. I loved the people I was around. When he called and asked me to come down and interview, on the way down, I'm thinking, there's no way I'm going to leave the Indianapolis News to go to the Bloomington Herald Telephone. After I'm in there, he's telling me what we are going to do, he and I. He said, of course you're going to go to every IU game, to the Final Four every year, and we're going to go to the Olympics. And I'm thinking, whoa, this is a little different thing than I was anticipating.
For a paper that size, that was a pretty incredible investment and commitment.
And they sold Bob. Dad sold Bob on that. He was diabetic, and in 1966, he lost his eyesight. It just killed him not to be able to read his own newspaper, but he continued to work, and our mom was a big part of that. And so were colleagues like Bob.
But in 1970, after just a few short years together, tragedy broke up the team of Perry Stewart and Bob Hammel.
Perry had died at 41 of acute diabetes.
I really think the personal and professional sides of Bob really stand out in my mind around the day my father died, because Bob was in Indianapolis covering the state high school basketball championship, which is the big show in the state of Indiana. And he found out my father had died, and he called the news desk and said he was going to have a column about Perry Stewart. So he wrote a beautiful tribute to this man who had hired him and his good friend. And at the same time, he wrote an incredible story covering the state high school championship game that year. So for him to have that kind of mettle, to be able to pull all that off beautifully, is just amazing to me and speaks to him not only, you know, and what a wonderful person he is, but also just what a pro he is.
He passed away about 4 years after he got here. And I went to Bob at that time and I said, I'd like you to stay and we'll finish what Perry started in putting out the best paper in Southern Indiana. And I hope that touched Bob's emotional being. I think it did, because he had great respect for Perry.
By the time Perry died, Bob and his family were settling into Bloomington and the rhythms of the now not quite new job.
You know, if you look at Bob's history, he moved around a lot in his early days of journalism. You know, he was at a lot of different papers until he hit Bloomington. And boy, he really stuck here. And I think he found something here, not only in what the HT gave him, but in what Bloomington gave him. Bloomington gave him a home where he felt he belonged.
I don't think my dad necessarily thought he would always be in Bloomington in terms of career, because of the track record up to that point. Dad would be very focused and concentrating on his work, and if I saw that he was kind of, stopped and not working, then we'd talk a little bit, but other than that, it was kind of just watch him go at it. And so he would work at night while I would be, studying and then going to sleep. So I would hear the old typewriter with the clangs and the carriage returns and, and all the keys.
Oh my goodness, yes. When we would be on a vacation in the hotel room, we would have the melodious sounds of the keys pounding away, and then the ding at the end of the line, and then back to the next line.
There were some benefits to having a sports writer as a dad that help offset those late-night keystrokes.
One of the first things that I can remember is after the Indiana University of Michigan game, I had ended up in the Michigan locker room, and I was looking for my dad after the game. And Indiana, with George McGinnis and all, had just destroyed Michigan. And I hear Johnny Orr talking, and he's talking about my father, and it wasn't really flattering. Apparently, my dad had quoted some quotes from Coach Orr that George McGinnis was apparently very motivated by. And so Coach Orr was kind of blaming my father for why they had gotten hammered so badly. And I remember coming out of the locker room and then seeing my dad, and I said, you don't want to go in there. Coach Orr is really mad at you. And he's telling all these other reporters, how upset he is with you. And he says, oh, that's okay. I'm going to go in there, And he told me he went in, and Coach Orr didn't say a thing about it to him.
My dad used to have a comb over, and when he went to the barber and decided finally he was done with the comb over, he actually had the barber cut the comb over off and put it in a little envelope for me. And I still have it to this day. Now he has that bright, shining, bald head, but I could always see whenever we would look in the arena, I could always find my dad going, oh, there's the shiny head.
Every job has its challenges, and sports writing certainly has its share. But Bob was resourceful.
There were a lot of days when we're into the countdown toward the deadline, I don't have the first clue on what I'm going to be writing a column about. And I would scan through the wires to see if anything just touched off an idea, and I had two sources early that, in desperation, I would call Doc Consulman in swimming and Sam Bell in track. One of those mornings when I was like that, I called Doc, and in the course of the conversation, he said he had to leave to go out to to the lake to swim. And I said, what's that all about? And he says, I'm getting ready to swim the English Channel. I said, oh, tell me about that. Explaining how his training regimen and everything. That paper came out that afternoon. Marge Councilman picked up her paper and said, "You're doing what?" So that was germinated by my desperation to find a column that day. It became a big deal.
I talked to Doc Councilman and I said, "Hey," I'd love to come to your university. And so we made arrangements for me to come out to visit the school. An interesting story about that was that Doc Councilman, on Sunday, the day I was going to be leaving, took me over to the woman that was the head of admissions, named Mrs. Robinson. And as I was walking up to her door, there was this sheet of ice, and I wasn't used to that kind of winter. And I fell right on my behind just as she opened the door. And I think Doc Councilman said, "I hope it's not a requirement that he's able to walk on ice to get into the school. Please, please don't make that a requirement." I said, "I love being in this position." I said, "I only have one place to look, and that's up."
Primary reason that we were focused on going to the Olympic Games was IU swimming under Doc Councilman. It was that big.
You know, from the very first time I set foot on campus officially, I think Bob was interviewing me, and he was always there, for our meets at home, and he traveled to some of the meets that we had, especially the Big Ten championships, the NCAA championships. He was a guy that was always invited. I mean, I know that he was there at Doc's home on occasion. He became part of the group. And it was funny, I was just talking to him. I think he did that for a reason, so that he would catch you off guard and you would say something that would give him an insight to what was going on. But he was around so often that wasn't really necessary. And everybody felt comfortable around it.
Going into the Olympics, the headline athlete of the whole games was Mark Spitz, the IU swimmer. I'm the rookie over there. I'm as green as you can get. Again, I'm back in that that color again as an Olympic reporter. Mark Spitz was the cover guy for Life magazine, Time, Sports Illustrated, Der Spiegel in Germany. Worldwide, he was the #1 athlete going into the Olympics. His performances up then showed he could win 7 gold medals. Nobody had ever won more than 4.
The reason I ended up swimming in all these individual events was that I held a world record in all of those individual events. So I knew that in 1971 that I had the capability of being able to swim those events. I wanted to get the 200 fly over first, and it was the first day of competition, because it was the event I got dead last in that I was a world record holder in 4 years before. So I figured if I can get that going, I'd be fine.
He won it, and that night he won on a relay. But he comes into the night's press conference, and all he says is, "Look, I've already been in here, and the other 3 guys on this relay team with me, this is their first time. I'd appreciate if you just talk with them." And so it was magnanimous and a very nice thing for a guy to do, but that wasn't the story I wanted. So I went to one of the team manager coaches and I said, "Look, I know this meant a lot more to Mark than he's saying there. I know he has a day off tomorrow. Could you see if if he could meet me at a given point in the Olympic Village at 10 o'clock tomorrow?" I went to that point, and 10 o'clock came, 10:15, they were going to Mark Spitz. So I thought, well, he hadn't agreed to it. And he did have this thing from Doc not to do any interviews, so I didn't really think anything about it. I just thought he decided it would be better, he shouldn't do it. And somebody came up to me and said, "Are you looking for Spitz?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I just saw him go in the hospital tent down here a little bit ago."
On Friday, I had no swimming. I had no prelims or semifinals or anything on Friday. So one of the things I decided to do was, after warm-up in the swimming pool, I went back to the village, which was a short walk. There was this crazy little a simulator, like a Formula One simulator. So I got into it, and I'm not a big guy, but I was about 6'1", and I had to squeeze into this little teeny thing. Getting out of it, I sort of wrenched my back a little bit. And I went to get some physical therapy with a massage and a heat lamp. So they made a big deal out of it, like I was injured,
So I came to 10, and I lied a little. I said I had an appointment to meet Mark, and I understand he's in here. Would you see if I could talk to him later today sometime?
And I remember that interview. He came in. He says, all right. I said, yeah, he's a part of the family. Let him in.
And the guy went back and he says, you're Bob Hammel? I said, yeah. And he said, come on back. So he's stuck there for 40 minutes. He doesn't have anything to do. So he took the chance to talk to somebody. Sounded like a good thing to him at that point. So I got the only interview with Mark Spitz at Munich because he just wanted to talk.
Just hours after Bob's interview with Mark Spitz, events at the Olympics would shock the world.
The latest word we get from the airport is that, quote, all hell has broken loose out there.
The world of sports was invaded by the bad elements in the society and in the world. The thing everybody noticed was security. We used to just wander in and out of games, and now you go through all the checkpoints and all the rest of it. A very, very big change.
Mark's 7th gold came the night swimming ended, and that was the night when the Palestinians came over the fence and seized the Israeli building. And the one press conference Mark was to have at 8 o'clock the next morning was where they announced to most of the press this had happened. I don't think the Palestinians were all that sports savvy. Had they been, they would have recognized that the most visible Jew in the world at that point was Mark Spitz. I wrote a column about the situation and walked them over to that AP collection booth. When I'd hand them in, they'd just look at it. The receptionist would always just look at it and take it. And she looked at it and she said, "Oh, you're Mr. Hammel. Mr. Johnson wants to see you." Mr. Johnson was the head of the whole AP operation in Munich. I walked through and there was a big paneled desk, and again, Bob Johnson comes out behind him, shakes my hand, and he said, "Bob, you know, we promised our clients we'd have our Major Spitz story tomorrow, Wednesday." He says, "I saw your story you did from your interview." He said, "Would you mind if we use your quotes from there?" And I'm thinking the Bloomington Herald telephone's going to be big news in the London Observer and all over the world. Yeah, we'll do it. That put everything that Mark Spitz had done in way into the shadows, as it should. It was the news development of the whole Olympics and of any Olympics. There's never been anything like that in Olympic Games where the world was so involved. It occurred to me 40 years later that that was actually not just America's, but the whole world's introduction to international terrorism.
The Munich Olympics wasn't the only life-changing event of 1972 for Bob.
72 was the opposite of a midlife crisis for me. It was kind of a midlife realization because I was 35 at that point. And that was also the first year that Bob and I was coaching basketball. Naturally, everyone was trying to discover who the new Indiana coach was going to be because they were very guarded about who they were interviewing. I did find out that it was going to be Bob Knight. I called Army and got the SID out there. He couldn't confirm it. He just was saying, if it is, they're getting this really intelligent basketball coach. The administration at that point at IU they couldn't favor us over the other Bloomington paper. Basically, their outlet was they were going to announce it the next morning, Sunday morning, in the Indianapolis Star. Bob was already in Bloomington at one of the people's homes, and the Indianapolis Star sports writer was there getting his story for the Sunday morning paper. We came out with it on Saturday afternoon, and it was wonderful.
When I first met Bob, I've never been a great fan of sports writers.
Try to help you young guys in this profession you've chosen. It's 1 or 2 steps above prostitution.
It was just the two of us, and then I said, by the way, what's your middle name? And he said, Montgomery, but don't use it.
I'd never introduced myself as Robert Montgomery Knight. I thought always using your full name or whatever was a little bit pompous, and I never did. I was just Bob Knight, period. That's it.
So that was the way we began.
So we didn't hit it off very well to start with.
He could see early that I was trying to work hard at what I did. He had various ways of describing that over the years. He said something along the lines of, he's really diligent at what he does. He says, prostitute is diligent, but he's a diligent prostitute. So, I guess it's a compliment, I think.
I think it's the reason Bob was able to have genuine close relationships with very difficult people was because Bob is at heart just a fundamentally honest man. What you see is what you get.
I'm smart enough to know when somebody's dumb and somebody's smart. And here's a guy that's a very intelligent guy. He obviously not only likes basketball, but he understands basketball. And I think that it wasn't too long after I came to Indiana that he became a friend, and a very good friend.
Coach Knight he was a bit complex. You know, he would say he didn't really care what the media thought of him, but he'd read the media and he'd see what they thought of him, and then sometimes that would get him a little bit upset, and my father would be telling him, why you care?
Vicky, on the TV show with Chuck, you came on and you announced this guy, Ivan Renko.
I invented Ivan Renko. I forget how far we went with him. You guys know more than I do.
Well, you went farther than I would like to. Well, Bob had a Sunday afternoon TV show.
The Bob Knight Show is brought to you.
He closed one show by saying, oh, by the way, we've got, I want to announce a new recruit we've just signed, this kid, Ivan Renko.
I mean, he's as good as our starters. He's an excellent offensive player.
But you dropped him on that TV show, and anyone who thought at all has to know you can't do that. You can't talk about a recruit. Immediately, all these experts, these guys that know everything, a great many of them came out with their own evaluations of this guy. And he just was exuberant about what kind of kid this was, what a great player they'd picked up. The first time he started in on it, I knew this is phony, because he can't talk about recruits. So it clearly was a joke, but it wasn't treated as a joke. Bob always had a purpose. And he was trying to expose these experts who always have their own opinion on any recruit.
And they jumped all over it. They were discussing Ivan Renko.
The majority of them had some kind of comment on the kid.
And I just sat there and laughed at him.
The ones that really impressed him were the few that said, I've never heard of this kid. I don't have anything to say about him. I don't have no idea who he is.
Yeah, I loved Ivan Renko.
Hams wrote a lot about Indiana basketball outside the newspaper, too. 10 books in all, including 2 that he wrote with his old friend, Coach Knight.
People that really like sports want to know how things are going and why this is being done or that's being done. He wrote so that they understood more about the game. And that I think they got an understanding of why I did what I did.
Forget about the crowds, the size of the school, their fancy uniforms, and remember what got you here.
I was such a fan, a loyal
Indiana University acolyte that I would get when I was living in California, a subscription to the Herald Telephone. And in those days, they would come in bundles once a week. So I would read everything that Bob wrote, probably for 20 straight years. When we finished Hoosiers, the movie came out nationally in January of 1987. So the movie was still sustaining with, 500 to 700 screens when Indiana ended up going to the Final Four. Now, we had, at that particular time, were nominated for 2 Academy Awards. It turned out that the night of the Academy Awards and the National Championship Final were on the same night. Now I was stuck with a dilemma. So I remember David Anspaugh, the director of the film, asked Dennis Hopper, who was one of the nominees, to go in during rehearsal and see if we could watch the game on, remember those Sony Watchmen? So we were gonna try to watch the game while we were there at the Academy Awards. And he came back with a negative response, saying that so much electronics around there didn't allow the reception to get through. I literally had a sleepless night on Sunday night. Woke up on Monday morning, and I knew I couldn't go to the Academy Awards. I had to watch that thing on television. So I called David, and he agreed. He didn't want to be the only guy to go, and so we stayed home, and we had a little party, and we had a TV with the Oscars on one television and the game on the other. So the next morning in the paper, on Tuesday morning, it has Hoosiers win national championship, and right down the sort of one of the bigger stories in the bottom half of the section is Hoosiers creators stay home to watch game, not go to Oscars. When Coach Knight read that paper when he got back, he said, "I want to meet these guys. Whenever they're back in town, have them stop by." I guess it was sometime in early fall. I went to practice, and during the whole practice, Coach Knight kept on looking up at me and just making a really negative face. I'm thinking, why? Is he pissed off at me? Why is he giving me such bad vibes? He must think I'm somebody else. At the end of the practice, he glared up at me and shook his head one too many times. I knew I didn't want to meet him. So I got up and I start walking out, and one of the managers runs after me and said, "Coach Knight needs to see you." I said, "Needs to see me?" He's not even, Coach Knight wants to meet you. He needs to see you. So I go down on the floor and I walk up. He turns and he looks at me, finally. He sticks his hand out. I thought he wanted to shake my hand. I reached to shake his hand. He shook his head. He said, "You owe me money." I said, "What are you talking about?" "All the dialogue that you used in that movie, stolen straight from me." And I started laughing, and he came over, put his arm around me. He said, "I love that movie." He said, "What are you doing right now?" I said, "Well, I'm going to go home, have dinner with my family and my parents." And he said, "No, you're not. You're coming with me and Bob Hammel. We're going to Chicago to look at a recruit."
One of the themes of Bob's life is an appreciation of the amazing people he's known. But what he won't tell you is about the appreciation that these amazing people have for him.
I met Bob when I was first in the football program and got to know him because he was essentially around, so I didn't know of his relationship with Coach Knight. One of the things that got me to know Bob, and I'm sure he'll tell the story, I was blessed enough to play as a freshman on the football team. We played the season, the last game was at Purdue, and I'm very much a mother's boy, mama's boy, so.
The football season ends on a Saturday. The very next Saturday, the basketball season opens. And they had a TV scrimmage the next day.
I'm preparing to go home for a day and a half, but it's the first time away from home for a long time. My game's on Saturday, I'm thinking Sunday. I go back sometime Monday, but I get, mother's cooking, mother's love, talk to daddy, all of those good things.
Bob Knight, he said, you'll see Buckner in the locker room afterward. He said, just tell him I'm expecting to be at the scrimmage Sunday.
I said, what? And that's the first time I really recall meeting Bob Hammel, when I was very much anxious to go home, and Coach Knight expected me in practice within 48 hours, having played my last football game, and Bob delivers this kind of bomb.
About 20 years later, Quinn said, I don't know what I ever told you. There was a day in my life when I hated you.
And then there was this kid who showed up one day for some writing advice.
My high school had an independent study program at the time, so I met with Bob and sort of gave him my pitch about how I wanted to learn the craft. And I also gave him a story, a first submission. And he took my story, and we agreed to meet again the next week. I had left a thank you note on top of the story.
This very, very young-looking high school kid shows up in my subterranean office.
So the next week I arrived, and he said that it had been a good piece of work, and he had a few suggestions.
I had read him as being a pretty cocky kid, and probably thought everything he wrote was golden and couldn't be improved on, and I marked it up pretty heavily.
I'm looking across the desk, and I'm seeing that the thank you note is covered in red ink, which gives you an ominous sense of what the rest of it might look like. And then eventually he removed the thank you note, and it looked like he'd nicked an artery. There was so much red on the manuscript. And he went through blood splatter by blood splatter and explained how it really was a good piece of work. And if I just removed these few things, which as far as I could tell was 95% of the manuscript, it had potential.
They had to give him another assignment, so he came back after he got this first one back. And it wasn't a rewrite of the first one, but but what he had done in the new writing, every point I'd made suggested what he could have done. He had incorporated everything immediately. I'd never seen anybody absorb things as quickly as he did, and he put it into practice right now. The second paper I had from him was really, really well done. And I thought then, this kid could be pretty good.
A few things really stood out there. One being how remarkably generous Bob was. He had no reason to give me this time. I also realized very quickly how serious he was about the craft of writing. I've never heard anyone talk about the craft with that level of exacting focus. And the demands that he wanted me to make were on myself. Over the years of talking writing with Bob and watching him work, I realized that's how he's approached the craft for his entire life.
I was edging toward retirement, but I had this biography in mind that I thought I'd like to try sometime of Bill Cook.
We began our production in that apartment, is where Cook started.
This would be in 1963. We came to Bloomington. We had no friends here, no relatives, no jobs, no income. He was determined to start his own business in Bloomington, in our apartment.
Bill invited me to speak after that lunch, and he said, I'm going down to the West Bay this afternoon to look at him. He said, would you like to ride along? He's driving. He said, how would you like to do my book? I'm one of those people who really thinks things out carefully, so about 8 seconds later, I said, I'd love to do that book. And I got a Bill Cook handshake. That's a contract.
When I started working for Bob, I was covering high school sports. I was covering Bloomington South and Bloomington North, mostly the girls' sports. But Jerry Yeagley had been hired as the soccer coach at IU, and they had started to win. And Bob had decided to put a reporter on this team, and so he assigned me. And so I started covering the IU men's soccer team in 1975. And they were great. They went to the national championship that next year. They became a big story in the city and then a big story in Indiana. So for me, it was a great opportunity because I was covering something that people were really paying attention to and reading, and I get all kinds of feedback from people. People were excited about it. People were going to games. So it was meaningful. And Bob just totally committed to covering them. Nobody was paying attention to soccer back then, and especially college soccer. And he saw that this was going to be a really good story. And so I was very fortunate that he gave it to me. 40 years ago, there were almost no female sports writers in this country. And Bob Hammel first hired Tracy Dodds, who preceded me by about 2 years, and then hired me. That wasn't done back then.
She was on track to be the sports editor of the New York Times and was hired away by ESPN.
Bob was pioneering. There were literally, at that point, 6 or 7 women, maybe total, working as sports writers in the United States. And 2 of them came out of the Bloomington Herald Telephone.
Blind luck. We just got 2 really good talents that showed up and asked for work and got it. But they both turned out so phenomenal.
Bob saw Kristen and Tracy as great talents that would be an asset to the paper, not as women who didn't belong in a newsroom. He had that gift, too, when it came to seeing people as people.
68 was the worst year of my life. The Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, the Tet Offensive, 68 was awful. Bloomington was a very active focal point of the earliest civil rights demonstrations. The most telling ramification of that here in sports was the 1969 IU football boycott.
Tuesday of this week, 14 IU football players failed to show for practice. All of them are black. On Wednesday, 4 came back to practice and 10 stayed away. Those 10 were automatically removed from the team. They chose not to play football for Indiana University.
10 black players walked off the team, and at a time when we all needed to be awakened to some of the subtle things that we'd tolerated and hadn't even thought about over the years that were discriminatory. And people who had no real involvement in football but saw the social issue and raised their own argument. There was a counter argument that of how things had always been done.
The issue goes deeper than that football team, right to this stadium, this campus, and this country. There are racial bigots in this nation, on this campus, and on Saturday in this stadium.
It was very difficult. The people caught up in it. The black players were that walked out, and then all of them were not allowed to come back. There were some really good kids in that group, and I hated to see that happen to them. But it was an explosive time, and it exploded. IU football took a long time to recover from it. It was at that point. It appeared to be on its way to being one of the better programs in the Big Ten. They'd gone to the Rose Bowl in '67. They had very strong teams in '67, '68. And we're off to a good season in '69, and that's when the boycott hit. They lost their last 3 games, had a losing season, and then And they had a very difficult time recruiting African American players for a good while after that. And a lot of the kids involved in that were from Indianapolis, and I'd cover them when I was at the news. I knew them personally, and it was a painful time. My carryover regret from that, and it's still true today, is that I didn't do more in an unprofessional way to step in and try to. I was one who could talk to them, and I was one who could talk to the football side and the administrative side, but I didn't do that. I was. You're disciplined. You're not the story. You tell the story, but I do second guess myself strongly on that, because that broke a lot of lives, and that was a shame. It shouldn't have happened. It should have been taken care of and dealt with. But keep these guys together. And I think athletics was the one visible point where people could see African Americans as heroes and stars and favorites, and cheer for them. And it was a long, hard struggle to get anything close to equality. And I can't speak for anyone else, but I felt really good when Barack Obama became president. I think that was a significant moment for me.
While we know the public Bob the journalist, there's a lot more beneath that public persona. The real Bob is a gentleman who deeply respects and cares about people.
George was born either 1893 or 1894, somewhere in there, in Kentucky. And I'm affiliated with the Monroe County Sports Hall of Fame. And what really put me on to him, when we started that Hall of Fame, I had done an interview with a guy named Cornelius Cook, who was from Bloomington, who played athletics at Bloomington High School and pitched in the Negro Leagues. He was one of the charter members of our Hall of Fame. To write that program piece, I went back and went over my notes, the transcribed notes from that interview, and there was one line that I hadn't pursued then because it wasn't germane to the writing about Cornelius Cook. He said, "I only pitched against George Shively once." And I thought, well, that must mean something. So I started Googling George Shively. And George Shively was a 7-time Negro League All-Star, 2-time MVP. I mean, there were some black players in the Hall of Fame now that didn't have the Negro League record that this guy does. And he was listed as from Bloomington, Indiana. Well, then I did all the background check on him. So I found out that he'd played at the both West Baden and French Lick hotels were thriving resorts in the early 1900s, and they each had a baseball team, and they were all black, and they were the reporters in the hotel, but each of those hotels just 2 miles apart had its own baseball stadium. Those hotels would play 100 games a year against each other. And the diamonds they had were of such quality that major league teams would stop. In 1909, the Pirates actually stopped off during the season in September on a trip from St. Louis to Chicago. They stopped off and played a game against George Shively and some of those stars of those teams and lost. I didn't think I could justify putting him in our Monroe County Hall of Fame just because he apparently lived here in the off season after he started playing baseball. But then it turned out that he and his father showed up on the Monroe County census in 1900 when he was like 6 or 7. They'd moved up here then. So he went to school here. Now he's our guy. So now I'm really digging. And found out that he was buried in an unmarked grave in Bloomington. What was on this committee, and I set out to try to raise some community funds to get a marker on his grave at Rose Hill. And we were going to discuss it at the History Center. I'm hoping to get $1,500, $2,000 out of it. We ended up with $18,000. So on April 5th of 2015, opening day of the Major League season, Easter Sunday afternoon, we had a ceremony out at Rose Hill dedicating that monument. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing, and people should go by and see it because that's a great tribute.
The fact that you all are here suggests I don't really need to tell you how genuinely great a baseball player George Souheil of Bloomington, Indiana was. The greatest player ever to come out of this city. And I can't imagine how today's kids could conceive of a time like that we allowed to happen, that we allowed that kind of discrimination to happen so recently ago, when skin color closed whole worlds to some. George Souheil was buried right here 53 years ago without a line in the sports pages noting his death or his distinguished life. On this Easter Sunday, when a religion is so much a part of George Souheil's faith and my faith, I like to think that at last he's feeling that community pride today.
I consider Bob a writer's writer. He cuts to the heart of what mattered. You never feel like here's somebody who's trying to write above my head or forcing me to learn new words and learn new expressions or new phrases. He's not making literary allusions that you're going to have to go to Google to figure out where he's headed with it. It's engaging. You want to read more. You want to read along with him, because you know where he's taking you is someplace worthwhile.
Bob is not just an exemplary sports writer, a real words craftsman. I think he's a terrific model as a citizen of this state.
Nobody worked harder than Bob, and no matter how young the staff was, nobody was going to outwork Bob. And that was a real lesson, I think, for young reporters to see someone who was not only as good as he was, but was out there working that hard all the time.
He's learning every day and always seeking to improve. And that was something for me that was very inspirational to see.
He brings a different perspective, and his very nature and intelligence and observation skills, even at this late stage of life, there's an energy about being around Bob Hammel because he's about doing things.
I thought he was honest, I thought he worked hard, and I thought he was very smart. He will always be one of my favorite people.
I'm Don Fisher, and from my seat in the press box, 50 years of Bob Hammel and Bloomington have really worked out well.
And they enjoyed learning about the game, don't you think?
Yeah.
Hey, Karen, see if Hammel's asleep.
We sold a lot of paper around the country.
Punch Hammel every once in a while, keep him asleep, to keep him from sleeping over there.
But I do have one more story. I wanted to just tell you that when I was on the tennis team at Bloomington High School North, we were playing at South, which is just across the street from the Bloomington Herald-Times. And my dad and my brother and my friend Nancy and my mom went to go see the tennis match, and they sat on the side of the hill where I was playing, which was a better view. Now, it happened to be inside the track field, so my match went a little bit long. By the time they got ready to leave, the track stadium was locked. And so they were trying to figure out how to get out of there because it was padlocked. And so they said, well, go get somebody. So I started to go get somebody, but then I noticed my brother was sliding underneath. My friend slid underneath the gate. My mom slid underneath the gate, but my dad could not slide underneath the gate. So he decided, if you can't go under, you can go over. So he started climbing up the fence, and it was about an 8-foot-high fence. He gets to the top, and he can't move. Now, these two track guys from South saw my dad up on the top of this fence. So they crawled over the top and they got him, and they pushed him up. But we were just laughing, thinking, here he is right across from the HT, a sports writer caught up on the fence. That's my dad.
For a DVD or Blu-ray disc of this program or other WTIU-produced programs, go online at shopwtiu.org.
Bob Hammel and Bloomington, a 50-year love affair, is made possible by Clendenning, Johnson & Boer, attorneys at law. Strength when you need it most. Indiana University Varsity Club, investing in the lives of student athletes. Smithville, the power behind life's moments. Weaver Popcorn, whether in the theater or at home, making popcorn part of memories. And by the WS Property Group, Eric Stolberg, Gentry Park, Bloomington, Old National Bank, Alejandra and Souheil Haddad, Curt Simic, Bill Walker. Additional support comes from Curry Auto Center, Heitink Veneers, IU Credit Union, McCrae and McCrae, Nick's Kitchen, the Trophy Center Plus, and by WTIU members. Thank you.